Okay, very good. Thank you everybody for joining us this evening. My name is Kurt Dicht. I am Vice President of Membership for the National Space Society. And on behalf of Larry Ahern, Vice President, we'd like to welcome you to our continuing series of virtual space forums and town halls. Tonight, the topic is factors impacting the sustainability of a lunar economy. And I'll be introducing our guest speaker in just a second. And let me just do this, we'll advance. So again, thank you for joining us for the Space Forum. Just to let you know the difference, the Space Forum is a session that talks about some of the issues related to space settlement, space technology, and so on. When we do our town hall meetings, those are topics related internally to NSS, such as benefits, like last week's town hall, or our leadership, that type of things, just so you know the difference. A little bit of etiquette tonight for the Space Forum. If you'd like to submit a question, use the Q&A function. Those are only seen by the panelists. So if you want to get something right to the panelists, you can do that. You can also use the comment, or to comment or ask a question, you can also use the chat function. Now that is public, so I would ask that everybody be respectful of the panelists and the audience when you do submit a comment or question. And we'll try to get as many questions as we can answered. There were quite a few that were submitted prior to the start when you registered. And we also, like last week, we might open it up and let some people ask questions. We'll turn on your microphone to let you do that. So we'll see how much time we have. But it looks like we have a really interesting discussion for tonight. So I'm going to be doing the introduction, and then I'm going to turn it over to our speaker for his discussion, and we'll close out with Q&A, and then we'll do what's coming up next in terms of our schedule and some final NSS announcements. So let me introduce our speaker this evening, James Plaxco, and I just call him Jim. Jim is the president of the Chicago Society for Space Studies. He is also a very, very dedicated volunteer on the society level for National Space Society, the NSS Director of Information Systems. He is the NSS Data Protection Officer. I first got to meet Jim a few years ago at the ISDC in St. Louis, and we've been working together ever since. Jim's kind of a Renaissance guy. He's a digital artist. He's a creative coder. He's a public speaker and a web consultant. And he's been involved in these NSS activities, I think, way back to 1993. So he's one of our space ambassadors, so he's a very accomplished speaker. So I think you're in for a very enjoyable evening tonight as we talk about some of these issues about sustaining a lunar economy. So Jim, I'm going to turn it over to you now, and I'm going to stop sharing my screen.
Great. Okay. Thank you, Bert. Well, I don't know how enjoyable this is going to be, since my whole, the centerpiece of my presentation is what is otherwise known as the dismal science. And tonight I'm not going to be offering any prescriptions, but rather simply an examination or a summary of the economic hurdles that face us in this. Oops, let me pop back there. So I'm going to kill my video since I don't need to be seeing myself talking. If I can get Windows to cooperate with me, which it is apparently, I guess I can't kill my video. There we go. Sorry about the, oh no. Let's see here. Okay, sorry about that. So really I'm here tonight because Larry Ahern had, yes. Yes, Bert? Can you hear me, Bert?
No issues. Yeah, no issues. Just wanted to know if you needed any assistance. Looks like you're set.
Oh, no, it was just the Windows thing. So, but really the reason I'm here tonight is because Larry Ahern had asked me about whether or not he could succeed in starting up a business on the moon. And, you know, if you had told me back when I was accepting my degree in economics that one day I'd be talking about commercial lunar mining and a lunar economy. I think I would have looked at you like you were nuts. And yet here we are tonight. So when I talk about a sustainable lunar economy, you know, unfortunately, the term sustainability is increasingly becoming little more than a slogan. So in my talk tonight, for me, sustainability simply means that over time, there is going to be positive economic growth to the extent that lunar industry can attract capital and that the people involved will experience a continual improvement in their standard of living and quality of life. So, and when I talk about economic growth, I also mean an increasing amount of economic diversity in terms of the productive activities. Now, there are several assumptions that I'm going to be making in this presentation, each having a differing degree of importance, namely that the market size will make investment of capital justifiable. A mining-dependent economy is not a bad thing. Transportation costs will converge, at least some, and that historical economic analogs are applicable to a space economy, and that we can reconcile the demand for factors when demand for those factors overlaps. So first and foremost is that there has to be a viable market for lunar products. Now, I define a viable market as one for which the size of the market and the demand price points for the goods and services are such that businesses in that market can succeed. Further, there is an expectation that the market will continue to grow and that it will subsequently become easier for businesses to prosper. Second assumption about the mining-dependent lunar economy, I don't think what we see here on Earth will apply to mining on the moon or the asteroids for that matter, because of the unique situation that they represent in terms of governance and in the high degree of technology requirements. I don't believe that space-based operations are going to fall prey to the same set of scenarios that makes a country's dependence on extractive industries here on Earth a bad play. For example, if you look at the table at the right on the screen, it's the International Council on Mining and Metals Mining Contribution Index, and this table lists the 25 countries whose economies are most dependent on mining. And if you look through the list, you're not going to find any OECD members on the list, and you'll note that these countries all have per capita GDPs that are quite a bit below average. So not an enviable situation. Now, the demon that has forever plagued the dreams of space settlement advocates is the demon of transportation costs. This statement by Jerry Kuczynski pretty well sums it up. You could have bricks of gold just sitting, waiting on the surface of the moon for someone to come along and pick them up, and you'd lose money bringing them back to Earth. And he made that statement at a time when gold's price was $10,000 a pound, which is coincidentally a number you frequently hear associated with the cost of delivering cargo to low Earth orbit. Now, for comparison purposes, a few years ago, I looked into transatlantic shipping costs and discovered that I could ship something like water from New York to Cairo, Egypt, at list price for a non-volume customer, 18 cents a pound. So that is a huge transportation cost differential. And that's going to be the one hurdle that technology development is going to have to be able to overcome to at least narrow the gap in transportation costs that we're seeing. So I guess arguably the biggest assumption I'm making is that that cost of transportation gap can be reduced to the point where if a lunar industry has a cost of production advantage, that production advantage can close the transportation gap so that if you have a customer on Earth, a lunar product would actually be price competitive with your Earth-based competition. Now, I will point out, though, that this requirement for a production cost advantage for the moon probably really doesn't apply to products for which you have no terrestrial alternative. And that would be something that's made taking advantage of zero-G manufacturing, or perhaps if commercial fusion reactors ever become a thing, you would have the potential for the mining of the moon for helium-3, which is here on Earth, but is probably not commercially practical. So the most reasonable assumption I'm making is that our existing economic models apply equally well to non-Earth economies. So for example, when you think of innovation, growth, and social well-being, communist and socialist economic systems don't work here on the Earth. Therefore, there's no reason to believe that those systems would work in any other setting. And consequently, that means that the trade models that we use here on the Earth to measure comparative advantage and to quantify trade between nations, those models should also work equally well with respect to a space-based economy. Now, the final assumption I'm making is, well, it's a given that there will be demand overlap between how we use the various factors of production. And that's going to impact our lunar economy and its total output. So I'm going to assume that how these factors are used is going to be optimally reconcilable in whatever competitive system we have in place. So, and by having these factors reconcilable, I also mean that they're going to be reconciled in such a way so as to maximize total economic activity. Now, earlier this year, the Mars Society held their Mars City State Design Competition. And I was on a team that entered the competition. And at times I got kind of dismayed by some of the policy desires of some of the folks on the economics team, because I saw those positions as being harmful to the possibilities of economic success. And if someone wants to ask me about the specifics of that, I can do that in the Q&A at the end of my talk. But really what I want to call attention to here is this quote from the competition guidelines, which appear to be stating quite simply that the only destination you have for your exports is going to be the Earth, and you have to be as self-sufficient as possible. So, and this is at a time when there's 1 million people living on Mars. So let's think about what that statement means about Earth being the only destination for exports. You're basically saying that Mars is going to be an autarkic system. Either that or it's going to be a mercantilist based economy. So now with globalization, we have a system of trade that integrates the world's economies and leverages our system of comparative advantages and consequently enhances the value of mass markets. But the system called for in the Mars competition, and which is unfortunately an all too commonly held view of space activists, the autarkic system they're calling for is going to result in a lower standard of living for all concerned. Now, I'll put a caveat on that and say that if your objective is to create a fully automated space economy whose real purpose is to simply ship goods back to the Earth for Earth consumption, then a mercantilistic approach does make sense. But if our objective is to establish human population centers around the solar system, then creating a series of isolated islands is, in my opinion, not the best solution for us. So given the nature of space, I mean, the desire to be self-sufficient is understandable. But when someone makes that statement about self-sufficiency, the question it has to be asked is why? What is being gained? So if autarky is deemed to be a bad thing here on Earth, why or in what circumstances could it be a good thing for someone living on the moon or on Mars? So the path that we pursue in establishing human settlements across the solar system is one that we have to think about. Are we going to be setting up a series of isolated islands of humanity, or are we attempting to create an integrated network of humanity that spans our solar system? Now, the most humanly complex challenge is going to be that of governance. Governance refers to all the processes of governing that are undertaken by some acknowledged authority, who with that authority is exercising control over either some defined territory or some set of organizations, either through the use of laws and enforcement mechanisms or the bayonet or the gun, So how you govern an economy, though, has a huge impact on whether or not that economy will be successful. Now, for me, good governance dictates that private property rights need to be provided because property is an asset. It's not just for its physical value, but as an asset that can be bought, it can be sold, and against which you can borrow money. So the Peruvian economist Hernando de Soto coined the term dead capital to describe an asset that can't easily be bought, sold, valued, or used as collateral. In short, the property is not what is known as a fungible asset. And this would act as a brake on economic growth, and De Soto cites it as an important contributing factor to the high level of poverty experienced by a number of nations. Going back to the Mars city-state design competitions, one of the policy proposals for businesses, and this was one of the ones I really objected to, was that anyway, businesses would be issued short-term leases for the land upon which they were expected to build their facilities. The problem was that at the end of the short-term lease, control of the land would revert to the governing authority, who could then do whatever they wanted to do with that property. So think about that. Ask yourself this question: would you undertake the building of a home on land for which you only had a short-term lease, with the leaseor retaking control of the property at the end of the lease, with no stipulation that you would be compensated for the structure you erected? I want to talk a little bit about the terrestrial metals market. Got interested in this with all the talk of asteroid metal mining and the headlines that said that asteroid mining would be a multi-trillion-dollar business. by 2020. So, so they've got a long way to go and only a couple months left to do it. But with respect to both lunar and asteroid mining, we have to consider the size of the market demand for those resources, particularly the Earth's demand and how that demand is distributed amongst the different metals. The question I have is, how does the scale of mining operations necessary to cover the costs align with the demand from Earth and other space markets for those resources? And in thinking of demand, I'm thinking in terms of both the quantity demanded and the price for that quantity. And we frequently hear talk with respect to platinum when it comes to asteroid mining. In 2015, 20% of the Earth's platinum demand was met by recyclers. By 2017, the amount being met by recycling operations had risen to 25%. So we can only expect recycling to make a bigger contribution to satisfying global demand in the future. Now, tied into the size of a market is the question of both the availability of substitute goods and the degree of competition between the other suppliers of any particular good. So if you're mining platinum on the asteroids, you have to consider platinum mining on the Earth, platinum recycling on the Earth, and whether or not there's anybody panning for platinum on the moon. So what happens to your business or your economy if your customers find an alternative to your dominant good? And that's where the substitute goods question comes in. So something to be considered in this context I should correct myself here, something to be considered in the context of multiple suppliers with respect to your competition is the question of factor price equalization, which says that the price of any commodity for which there are multiple suppliers, that price will converge. So what happens to you if your cost of production is greater than the convergent price? So will lunar metal mining operations be able to compete against asteroid miners? An earthly example of this is with respect to the oil industry and what happened to oil fracking operations here in the US when the price of oil dropped below the fracking operations cost of production. You had widespread shutdown. Another consideration for a lunar economy is going to be how well diversified it becomes. An economy that produces only a limited variety of goods, which can be measured by an economic diversification index, is going to be more vulnerable than an economy that has diversified and produces a lot of different goods. If you look at the table on the right in the screen, you'll see an illustration of this. What I've done here is I've listed both the most as well as the least complex economic systems according to Harvard's Economic Complexity Index. What the index reveals is that there's a strong inverse relationship between economic complexity and both per capita GDP and the United Nations Human Development Index. Now, I recently saw a cartoon and it had a couple of robots standing by the proverbial office water cooler in what was an otherwise empty office. And one robot saying to the other robot, oh, they call it the flu season. Now, it's a given that it's going to take significant amounts of capital to build the infrastructure needed to keep people alive on the moon. That means that the value that these people need to add to the lunar economy has to be greater than the value of the output that the capital could have produced if it had been used towards the construction of automated manufacturing operations. So if you just think about it, if people were as cheap as robots, we'd be sending people and not robots to explore Mars, the asteroids, and the moon. So capital deepening is one measure of our increased reliance on capital to automate production. And that automation translates into productivity gains. If you look at Earth's advanced economies, you'll see that productivity growth and a rising standard of living are both tied to an increasing reliance on capital. And another term for this is capital intensity. A business needs capital if it wants to purchase the next generation of equipment that will allow it to more efficiently use its inputs to create output and consequently increase its productivity. So now, as an example of this, it's been estimated that by automating the assembly of the 1979 solar power satellite design reference system, completely automating that would reduce or could have reduced the cost of the SPS system by a factor of 20. And that cost reduction just possibly might have made SPS generated electricity commercially competitive with Earth-based generation of electricity. Now, it's a given that to build a business or an industry, you're going to need capital, and capital is in limited supply. And it's going to preferentially flow to those investments that minimize risk and maximize payoff. Now, this chart illustrates the role that automation has played in improving the productivity of US manufacturing. So the question, I think, is will lunar industries have what it takes to get the investment capital they need to build their industry? And it may be that they have to seriously consider completely automating their operations to reduce their costs sufficiently that those businesses do become practical and worthy of funding. So this is a diagram wherein I offer up a vision of the sort of space-based economic system that we space advocates have long dreamed of. I want this to work. The challenge is with the how do we get it to work? What needs to be done? How do we go about it? Because what we have here is a really complex equation for which I think we currently have more questions than answers. So Larry, I'm finally going to answer that question you had asked about starting Larry's Moon Mining Incorporated. You've got lots of barriers, or I should say hurdles, that you're going to have to think about. You have to consider the system of rules within which your business is going to have to operate. You got to consider, is there going to be a market for what it is you want to sell? And will you be able to sell at a price that will cover your costs? With respect to your customers, are you going to be the dog wagging the tail? Or are you going to be the tail that's getting wagged by the dog, meaning who's in the driver's seat, you or your customers. So, and regardless of which trade model you want to use to do your analysis, lunar industry is going to be competing with both Earth industries and other space-based industries for customers, you know, whether it's asteroid miners or zero-G manufacturing facilities in low Earth orbit or at one of the Lagrange points. So that concludes my presentation. There is a paper version of this talk that appears in the Return to the Moon 7, which is the proceedings of the 2020 Lunar Development Conference that was held back in July. And it's available as a Kindle edition over on Amazon. So if you're interested in buying that book, I suggest you go to the space.nss.org website and click on our Amazon Smile link and make sure you get yourself set up so that when you use smile.amazon.com, NSS will get a contribution from Amazon as a part of any purchases you make on that platform. So at this point, I just want to say thank everyone, and I'm going to stop sharing my screen and turn the controls back over to Bert. And hopefully you all heard all that.
Yep. Thanks so much, Jim. Let me turn my camera back on. We did get one of the things in chat that just asked, they asked about the recording, so we will be having a recording that's available, but they did want to know if you'd be able to make your slides available for people. I don't know if that's possible.
Well, actually, I was very particular about going through and making sure that there is nothing here that is going to violate anyone's copyright, because a lot of the images were done by myself, and if they weren't done by me, they're images that are in the public domain. So I'll think about making them available. If I do, they'll be on the chicagospace.org website. So
great. Very good. So why don't we get to some questions, and that we will take some that came in through the chat, through the Q&A, and some that came in through the registration. But let me just ask you, I'm a historian as well, and studied the growth of, let's say, the colonies and how their economies developed and what it takes. What do you didn't really give a time frame, but if you saw things progressing like you would want to see them progress in terms of a lunar settlement, how long do you think it will take to have a sustainable economy?
That is going to depend, I think, on two big issues. Technology is not one of them. Governance. What is going to be the system of incentives that are put in place? And are those incentives going to be a spur or a drag on development? The second one is markets. So what I would like to see, and it may be the only way forward, at least in terms of really helping accelerate things, is for state actors to increasingly rely on the private sector for purchasing the services that they need, so that I would want to see government set up as a customer of, rather than a competitor to, private entities. We had that experience in this country with our space shuttle program, which nearly killed our domestic launch industry because government wanted everything to launch on the shuttle. Unfortunately, it took the Challenger accident to begin to actually realize that having the shuttle launch everything was really not the optimal choice. Although the Europeans in Aryan space were very appreciative of that policy because they were able to pick up a lot of business, you know, as a consequence of that shuttle launch only policy. So the speed with which it happens is a question of the speed with which we resolve the governance issues and get incentives in place, and the degree to which governments or state actors create a demand market that becomes an attraction to initially the launch industry. And then there's also the question of, as these costs come down, do they come down to a point at which other players who had been on the sidelines can now enter that market space and become new customers, and thus creating what's referred to as a virtuous cycle. So, but timelines, it's up to us. I read books from the 60s and you see where people in the know at the time were predicting that we would be by this point in time. Neil deGrasse Tyson spoke at an ISDC many years ago, and it was about the delusions of space activists. And he had it right, but he also had it wrong, because he started off by talking about people who said, like, oh, man will never fly. You know, there's no use for the radio. No one will watch TV. A rocket will never travel in space. And then he goes on and starts listing out predictions made by space advocates and saying that they were, you know, a little bit delusional. But there was a critical difference. The front end of his talk was about scientists making statements saying, I don't think this is going to happen, because at the time they made that statement, that technology did not exist. The technology to make that thing possible wasn't out there. The difference is that with the space advocates, the statements we were making did not require new technology. What they required was a commitment on the part of individuals, politicians, nation states to push these developments forward by, well, let's be blunt, spending money on them. But the money wasn't there, so.
Right. Yeah, very, very interesting observation. So let me get a couple more questions that came in. And one, I think, ties into what you were discussing about the capital that would be needed. So our member wanted to know, where will most of the initial capital come from? Will it come from governments and space agencies? Or is it going to come from the private sector? Or possibly a mixture of both?
Yes to all of them. It all depends on which route we choose to take. Governments may dramatically pull back from funding human space operations. Perhaps the space tourism industry takes off, and with competition, you have something of a continual game of one-upsmanship, where the first company says, we'll fly you suborbitally. The next company comes along and says, well, we'll take you on a full orbit of the Earth. And then someone else comes along and says, we'll fly you around the moon. Someone else comes along, and I'm thinking Golden Spike here. I think it was Golden Spike that says, we'll fly you to the moon, we'll touch down and land. You don't get to get out though, but you can look around, and then we take off and return to Earth. So to the extent that that market grows, that could become the driver, in which case private capital for private businesses would be the driver. Or it could be that ISS is going to be going away. What if we could convince NASA, the US government, to rent space on a privately constructed space station in low Earth orbit? You've then got your anchor tenant. If you think about the way large shopping malls work, you have a couple of anchor tenant stores that are designed to bring in the customers, and they're able to then use those anchor tenants to bring in all those little smaller shops that otherwise could never afford to be in a place like that. So it could be that it's a combination of the two. And we kind of see that, you know, somewhat with the Space Act agreements, where the business pays for it and it's still their product, but there's milestones along the way. And as they meet milestones, they get compensation, you know, from a governmental agency. So it's really difficult to say because we really haven't set out on the path yet. We're still sitting here in our room, scratching over our heads over, you know, how do we want to go about this and who's going to lead the way?
Right. You mentioned in the talk about that cartoon with the robots. And I see a couple of questions that came in the chat about robots, and there were a number of questions that came in that were submitted during registration about robots. Could this economy be robot-based versus human-based?
Well, I'll tell you a little story, and I mentioned half of this like in my presentation. A lot of people think that solar power satellites will be a real boon to the economy. It's clean energy, you know, zero greenhouse gas emissions. It's very heat efficient, you know, unlike traditional combustion oriented sources for generating electricity. Mobile, you can get it to where it's needed. So wonderful idea. Now, if you remember Gerard O'Neill's book, he was going to build a space colony. Now, ask the question, well, what are the people, the 10,000 people on this space colony going to do for a living? They were going to build the solar power satellites. Now, if you think about the cost, and I updated the numbers for the cost of the Island 1 colony. I think it was like the average or the minimum income anybody could make and live there was on the order of $100,000 a year. So these would every one of these people would have to be a very high value worker. And the thing that really sunk SPS, aside from what was deemed as being an immature technology readiness level, was the number of man hours it would take, and the fact that they were talking about having 600 astronauts living in space to build this system of solar power satellites. That just made it SPS an economic fantasy. Now, if you were to fully automate that, then, and it does bring the cost down by a factor of 20, then potentially SPS becomes economically viable. So if your objective is clean energy for Earth, then you'd want to see those satellites get built, and you'd want to see them built in such a way that we could afford to buy the electricity. But if your real objective is having people in space, you have to ask yourself, okay, then what are these people going to be doing to justify the cost of keeping them there? So, and that is something we have to decide, do we want to use space? And it may be that, we could go about this in two phases. Phase one is we establish robotic communities on the moon, on Mars, on asteroids. They ramp up their ability to mine and produce to the point that we give or get space operational costs down low enough, because we've expanded the scope and the scale of our space operations, that it actually becomes economically possible for people to afford to pull up stakes here on the Earth and move and live at one of these destinations. So we're ways off from that, but I just hope that, the path we take is one that's less about the short term and more about thinking really about the long-term viability of space settlement.
Tying into that with humans versus robots, a question asked about how much of a space settlement on the moon would need to be resupplied from Earth. And obviously, if you're talking about 1,000 people working on the moon, will there be enough resources for them, water and food and so on?
Mm-hmm.
Or will we have to get things from Earth up to them until that becomes sustainable? So it does beg a good question. Can we afford to do that?
There are two things you have to consider in responding to that. The first one is, examining, okay, how much mass do we have to send to the moon in order to offset some fraction of supplies that would otherwise have to be transported from the Earth? So do you have a sufficient mass payback ratio to make it worthwhile? The second thing is whether or not you're committed to the long term. If you're going to send 100 people up there, but you think you might be pulling up stakes in a year or two, there's no point in establishing the facilities that perhaps might require 5 years or more of operation to pay back the investment cost. So, and again, that ties back into, how we go about setting things up. We don't want to do things that are short term. We really, I think, need to be smart about this and plan as best we can, because long-term planning is hard, but plan that, we are going to go there and stay. So what's the best first step that moves us in that direction and keeps us moving in that direction?
Right. In terms of the product, people ask, what will be the main product that could sustain an economy? I know you mentioned the space solar power, and that's also a question that came in about what kind of role that will play. But you also talked about metals, helium-3. So do we see something that could emerge as the go-to product?
The thing about go-to products is they're never predicted in advance. So,
yes.
And I am a lousy prognosticator, if that's the right way of phrasing it. Right now, helium-3, and remember I was quoting from Jerry Kaczynski, who was saying, gold bricks. Well, he's an advocate for mining the moon, but not for gold or iron or any of those other mundane metals. He wants to mine the moon for helium-3. And that would be great. And yes, it would pay for itself, but that presumes we have commercial fusion reactors running down here on Earth. And I have to point out, of the alternative fuel sources that are spoken of when you talk about fusion reactors, helium-3 is the hardest because it has the highest ignition point temperature. So it would be the most challenging fusion reactor to design and build. But so that's a leading contender. I think in the early days, you know, for a long time it'd be scientific knowledge. So there's great value there. But, you know, people love souvenirs. I've been places in my life where it's like the only product they sell in the town besides food is souvenirs of the fact that you were in the town. So I think there'd be a fair amount of interest in, you know, whether for purely souvenir basis or for scientific study, lunar samples. So that may be enough to get the ball rolling, and you ramp up from there. So
I could see a great market for fridge magnets from the moon, right?
there you go. There you go. Yeah, but I'm really, I don't want to use, I hesitate to use the word disdainful, but I have spoken with people who thought we'd be mining the moon for things like iron and nickel. And I just don't see that as being economically at all plausible. You know, and we do have to consider also if the value, the price per ounce or per pound goes up, then we're going to start seeing more recycling operations here on Earth. So, so that's your competition too, is not just what sources there are yet to be mined on Earth, but it's all the stuff we've already mined that we just have to reclaim and recycle. And that's going to obviously influence the price, because price is determined in large part by the demand for that. So.
Yeah, one of the questions that did come in was about protecting the lunar environment from the effects of the settlements. So that obviously would factor into the costs.
Well, my question with that is, what is it we would actually be protecting? There is no biosphere there, and the entirety of the surface has been pummeled by asteroids and comets and micrometeorites for millennia. Anything that was there has been pulverized. So again, it's a question of protecting the moon from what? Now, someone could or might answer, well, we want to preserve the lunar vacuum for some reason so that you don't have a lot of particulate getting injected. So would that interfere with observatories on the moon? Potentially. So, and the moon, even though I chastised my son tonight, we were talking about friction and rockets and the moon and that, and he was saying, well, and I was telling him, well, the moon has no atmosphere. Well, yeah, it does technically have an atmosphere, but you know, it's how many molecules per cubic meter.
Yeah, not one that humans could survive in. That's for sure.
Yeah.
There was a good question. I don't know if you could answer it. It's kind of an X factor question. But yeah, the space junk. Do we need to clean up the space junk before we could have a true lunar economy? Because the space junk has potential to damage spacecraft and so on as we go back, as you're going back and forth. So is that something that would need to be taken into account? I know people are looking at space junk at this point, yeah, but I don't know of any solutions.
The space junk solution is really, you know, a question of governance. Who is going to be paying? You know, the Chinese blow up a satellite in low Earth orbit. Should the American taxpayer pay to clean it up? You know, and the Chinese take a free walk. So we act, to the best of my knowledge, we really don't have any liability standards for what I will call space pollution. So whether or not, I don't think we need to clean up space before we can do the moon, but it certainly is, in my mind, something we really do need to address, in the nearer term, because the debris creates risk, and risk scares people away, scares investors away. So
Jim,
people, yes.
yeah, this is Larry Ahern. When you talk about risk, all through history, we've had people from spice trades, caravans going, trade routes all over the place, and people trying to corner the market. But the one thing that was the persons that would insure these ships going from all over the place was a thing called Lloyd's of London. That, when I was talking to you earlier about business on the moon, I was talking not about mining, but I was talking about insuring these people. And I said, Lloyd's has been around for about 350 years, and a lot of consortiums are all gone now, except a good example of some of the consortiums that are still in operation is De Beers, which has a pretty good hold on the diamond market, and OPEC until, like you said, fracking and stuff, until technology overcame them. They were trying to control oil prices by controlling the resources. So I said, there's a whole bunch of games can be played on this whole thing, but between governments and consortiums and things like that. So when you're talking about a small person coming up there, establishing a business up there, that's not going to happen too easily.
Well, with respect to risk and insurance, the launch industry had some serious challenges a few decades back because of the cost of purchasing insurance. And that was an operational cost. And that got translated into the launch providers being forced to charge higher prices, which then shrunk the size of the market. So again, risk is a factor you don't want to be messing around with. But that's the nice thing with private entities is that, you know what? If SpaceX wants to play a risky game with its own money and its own spaceship, okay, that's kind of on them if they're willing to launch, let's say, without purchasing insurance. And I have no idea if they purchase launch insurance for their vehicles. Presumably, but I know it's not true in all cases, but presumably the customer that is having their satellite launched on top of a rocket has separately purchased insurance for their satellite in the event that there's a malfunction. And there have been instances where the satellite provider looked at the cost and decided it wasn't worth it. And at least once that I can remember, they wound up regretting that decision because the rocket actually did malfunction and their satellite was a total loss. So.
Very good, Jim, thanks. We're just about 10 o'clock. I'd like to get a few more questions in that came in via the chat and the Q&A before we close out. So let me read one that came in. There are a great many mines on Earth mining asteroid impacts. For example, Sudbury, Ontario today has been mined for copper and nickel for around 100 years with no signs of running out. Every impact crater on the moon and other places in the solar system has the same type of resources possible, including iron. Has this been a target of mining on the moon, or do you think that might be a target?
I expect that it might very well be a target, but probably only for local consumption once the size or scale of a lunar economy has ramped up sufficiently. And I forgot to mention this in my presentation, but one of the things that we see happening here on Earth is that mining companies are increasingly turning to automation to carry out mining operations, because like in the gold mining industry, human labor is a huge factor cost. And so it's like, okay, how can we reduce our total costs and consequently increase our productivity? And so automation is really going like gangbusters. So, which is driving down their cost of production. And if we're talking about automated mining on the moon to give the moon a cost advantage, well, if Earth miners are using the exact same techniques, they've just wiped out that cost advantage, and you're falling back more heavily up on the transportation cost component. So.
I had another question about robots that I think you kind of touched on. Let me just find that one. One real advantage of humans versus robots in space is the availability of humans to deal with the unexpected. At the beginning of the process of building out on the moon, therefore, a human presence will be advantageous. Agree, disagree?
Depending on, I'm already inclined to disagree. I mean, now we're talking about rolling out robotic surgeons, you know, robots that will have the knife in their little metallic claws, you know, to cut you open. With the advances we've made, my son just bought a car. It's semi-self-driving. So with the great advances that are being made, and I expect will continue to be made over the next few years, we are increasingly coming to a point where we seriously have to think about, you know, how much resource we want to devote to a human component, you know, being a part of any lunar-based system. So I think it was in the first episode of The Expanse. So Bert, you were in California with Jeff Bezos, and we had the crew of The Expanse here, and they were all excited about getting picked up. But I remember watching the first episode of that, and you've got the two astronauts in their spacesuit. So obviously they're in the vacuum of space. They're working in a very hazardous situation. And an asteroid, or well, a chunk of an asteroid comes over and laps off the one guy's arm. Oh no, well, not to worry, we'll just take him to the med bay and we'll grow him a new arm. Now, the question I asked was, why are these idiots out there? Why don't they have a robot doing this kind of dangerous work? They're certainly not that smart if they're putting people in a very dangerous environment to do work that a robot could have done, you know, just as easily. So.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. Two more questions and then we'll call it an evening. So one has to do with space tourism. Is that, because I know you've got that behind you there as your virtual background, but will lunar tourism be a moneymaker for, you know, the reality is if it's going to make money for people who on Earth who actually launch the people there, but will people be able to spend money there? So
on day one, in the first year or so, no, they won't be able to spend money there. But I would expect, as I say, you know, that this continual ramp up. What is the next big thrill? So suborbital to orbital to circumlunar flight to a quickie landing on the moon to a short stay on the moon to a longer stay on the moon. And as each of these developments occur, I think it's very reasonable to assume that the price will continue to come down so that the market for the product will continue to grow. And so suborbital, which once upon a time only the wealthiest could afford, well, they're no longer interested in that. They want to go to the moon, but now the next layer down of folks are able to afford suborbital because the suborbital operators want to stay in business. I recall, I guess it was in the 90s, late 90s. I was at one of the big computer shows in Chicago, and I see this big crowd of people, and I have to walk over, okay, what are they all looking at? They were looking at a computer monitor that I guess is about the size of the computer monitor that I have sitting on my desk. What was truly revolutionary about it was flat. There was no tube. It was like, oh my goodness, I've never seen anything like this. Now, my monitor here, I picked up for a couple $100, you know. If something goes wrong with it, you throw it out and get another one. But what, 22, 23 years ago, a monitor like this, their price tag was $15,000. So we can see how the market has developed. And as the market scales up, the technologies become better understood, and you have productivity gains, your price can come down dramatically.
Right. Very good.
And I don't think there's any reason to believe that a space economy, a lunar economy, call it what you will, I fully expect the same set of scenarios to play out there as they have here on the Earth.
Very good. Last question, and I think this was an interesting one. I know we've talked about mining the moon and using that for creating the products, but question had, what about using the moon's ultra vacuum to produce unique products? Interesting question.
Go to Leo. That would be the first place for that. And the other question you have to ask yourself is, when you look at a cost equation, how dominant is the vacuum processing part or factor in that equation? Is it a small factor? Is it 90% of the total cost of the product? And if it's a product meant for Earth consumption, can you do it on the moon and send it back to Earth and offer it at a price where you're actually, you know, competitive in the market with someone who is using their earthbound vacuum chamber, which is, it's been a long time since I've followed up with anything about vacuum processing, but I know once upon a time, it was incredibly hard to have a vacuum here on Earth that was as good as what you get naturally, you know, once you get far enough away from the Earth. I don't know what advances have been made. And I also am not aware of the added degree of benefit you get from a somewhat impure vacuum being replaced by a very pure vacuum. You know, what is the cost increment there?
Very good. Thanks, Jim. And I will refer everyone to something that appeared on our chat from Joe Bland. He talks about that the use of a vacuum on the moon for manufacturing becomes interesting if the product being manufactured uses lunar materials. An LEO system would require that the materials come up from the Earth. So that is an interesting perspective. Yep. So I think with that, we're going to close things out, Jim. I just want to thank you for a great presentation and for your patience in answering all those questions, because there were quite a few. But thank you so much. We really appreciate it. We look forward to another round sometime, possibly on another topic. That sounds
Wonderful.
good.
I look forward to it as well. Thank you, Bert.
Very good. So let me close out. I'm going to be sharing my screen in a second. And so if everyone just bears with me, let's do this. So there's Jim again. So I want to turn over the session to Avinash, our new board of director member, who is going to briefly talk about something big that's coming up, starting actually on Sunday, the World Space Week, and his NSS India chapter. Avinash, it's all yours.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, already you have put up the flyer, so I need not share a screen. So we have a full 7 days program. As everyone knows what World Space Week is, how it has started from 4th October 1957 was the first launch of Sputnik 1, and 10th October 1967 as a United Nations treaty opening the space for the whole mankind and not a property of any particular nation. So 4th October to 10th October is celebrated all over the world as a World Space Week. And it is the biggest space event in the world. Sorry. So we have been celebrating it quite some time. And this year we have 7 speakers, and we had a limitation of time zone between USA and India. So it's a Friday morning today, it's 7:45 a.m. So it must be around p.m. in Pacific time or Eastern time. So on 4th October, which happens to be Sunday, and 10th October, which happens to be Saturday, we had another limitation for time because of the Indian Premier League cricket. And probably everyone knows how crazy Indians are after the crazy cricket game. So I was advised by our friends that if you have anything at the time of cricket, nobody would be there to join your program. So I had that start time considering the time zone of USA and end time, that is the beginning of the cricket game. So I had to squeeze it like that. So on 4th of October, we have Dr. M. Annadurai, who is a former director of UR Rao Satellite Center, ISRO, and he's going to talk on emergence of satellite technology to improve quality of life in India, a way forward. He's supposed to be an authority, like a father of Indian satellite program. Then on 5th October, we have the great speaker, John C. Mankins, and he's going to talk on lunar exploration, development and settlement. On 6th October, we have space solar power. Our Joseph Blunt, he is going to talk on that. On 7th October, we have Pascal Lee, who is going to talk on humans to Mars. Probably the title may change a little one, but the basic gist remains the same. On 8th October, we have Al Globus, a great presenter. He is going to talk on space settlement, equatorial low Earth orbit. On 9th October, we have Anita Gale. She's going to talk on educational and career opportunities in space technology, because she has been conducting competitions and contests, and she has been visiting India twice a year to conduct these competitions. So it is going to be a very, very exciting program and her presentation for students in India. And on 10th of October, again, we have the great speaker, Sri A.S. Kiran Kumar, who is the former chairman of ISRO. The chairman of ISRO is equivalent to the NASA administrator post. So we have 2 Indian speakers, and considering the cricket, we have placed it at 11 a.m. in India, which is 10:30 p.m. Pacific time. So I think 10:30 p.m. is not a bad time for these 2 presentations. However, if somebody misses it, it will be streamed live on YouTube, and it will remain on YouTube, so anybody can watch it even at a later date. So my request to everyone to join it and have advantage and benefit of such wonderful, wonderful presentations during the whole week. Thank you, Bert, for giving me this opportunity.
Oh, thank you, Avinash. It looks like a great program, and we will send out the link as well to everybody as we follow up. So you'll get that. But as Avinash said, it'll be on the YouTube if you do miss it live. So look for that email. So thank you, Avinash. Looks like a great program. In terms of our space forums and town halls, what's coming up next, and you saw Jim's virtual background, the SpaceX, Blue Origin, and space tourism is the topic for next week on October 8th. And I'd love to tell you that we're giving away a free ticket on one of the commercial spacecraft, but unfortunately we're not doing that, but at least you'll hear about it. And so look forward to that. We'll be sending out more details. We've got some plans for events going through the end of the year up to December 10th. We're going to have a little bit of a shutdown later this month because of the debates here in the United States. So we'll be sending out a more detailed schedule and invites. So look for all of those things as well. And again, as I close out for the night, again, a reminder to check out our website. If you are a member, please check out our member portal, inside.nss.org. And finally, a last item, again, we're looking for your support. So our NSS Secretary and Board Member Anita Gale, who's going to be part of that World Space Forum, has made a very generous offer to match up to $100,000 in donations. So whatever you might want to donate to the NSS, whether it's $5 or $50 or $100, would be doubled. So I will be sending out this presentation to everybody so you have all the links, but feel free to take a screenshot as well. So with that, I just want to thank Jim again for a really very informative presentation, Avinash for sharing what's happening with the World Space Forum, and also again, Fred Becker for all his assistance in running these space forums and town halls as my backup co-host, and Larry, President of Chapters, who is our booking agent and scheduling and getting all the talent for these presentations. So again, everybody, I just want to say thank you for joining us. We will get a recording out as soon as it's available, and we hope you'll join us next week for the Space Tourism presentation and for all the other presentations we have coming up. So again, good evening if you're here in the States. Have a great day, Avinash, there in India, and just want everyone to be safe. Everyone, take care.